of the things that has struck me in thinking about your work and approaching these questions is this matter of your background. I've read, of course, that you studied engineering, and to get to this question, what impelled you to either become an artist or understand the nature of art? What do you think, what would you finger as the most compelling moment or the most compelling circumstance that would have led you to this direction?
Well, my first memory of art was really when I was still very young. I think maybe I was around 7 years old or something like that in Manila. And funny enough, I was actually in our little library and I was reading Reader's Digest. And I always seemed to sort of gravitate towards, like, let's say the works of Velázquez or the works of Goya and stuff. That they have these little things, really light reading. For a 7-year-old, it's quite wonderful to sort of read about it. So I seemed to sort of gravitate towards that, and I did little bits of drawings. And I remember also from elementary school how much I enjoyed doing art classes, and I would enter competitions and I would win, and sometimes I wouldn't win, but that's okay. But there's always that element of being wanting to create something, but that's always been in the back burner. My family is a lot of us are actually quite professional going, I have a brother who's a doctor. My father's an engineer. 2 of my brothers are engineers. So there's this sense about going into getting a degree somewhere that has to do with either engineering or being a doctor or being a lawyer. Maybe that's just a typical sort of like expectation. People want, your parents want you to succeed, so that those are the profession that they try and purport. But a lot of things happen during that time, from the time that I left Manila and immigrated to Canada, because when that happened, a lot of that world kind of like disappeared because I had to leave Manila because of the Marcos regime. And so making it here in Canada means I have to sort of re-educate myself in terms of being certified as an engineer, and I didn't want to go through that again. And all this time, there was always like this interest in art. And I remember when I got my first job and progressed into more the information technology type of employment, that I sort of like became, I appreciated art. I go to art galleries, and then that kind of like progressed into art making, but it wasn't really as direct as that. It's almost like something that just kind of happened. I started off as wanting to collect art, and then I befriended a gallerist here in Vancouver, and we had really wonderful conversations about art. She had a gallery on South Granville. And one day she was just saying, I've never seen your art. And I said, well, okay, well, why don't you go and I'll show you some of the work that I do, and maybe we can have a show of it, I don't know, see what happens. At that time, I wasn't really producing for any public or anything like that. And so what happened there was that I was included in a group show that was curated by then UBC professor Robert Young. So there were I think 8 or 9 artists. I was the only one that's not from Robert Young's class. Some of those artists are actually, some of them are represented by Monty Clark now, and so the group show happened, and then I had 3 pieces, and the 3 pieces were sold. to various members of the board of directors of the Vancouver Art Gallery. And so I said, okay, well, that's easy. So I had a solo exhibition the next year, and that first solo exhibition got a review in Canadian Art Magazine. And I thought, wow, this is actually not bad. So I wasn't really intending on getting into that. It just kind of like these things that happened. And at the time, I wasn't really highly critical about my work. I was really more into an intuitive sort of phase, trying to sort of deal with what my personal interests are. The work that I went through trying to educate myself was also concurrent with the work that I was doing, because I've been known to work with a lot of books that I deconstruct. And before I deconstruct them, I have to read them from cover to cover. So in a way of, let's say, I must have produced, so I don't know, maybe about close to 200 or 300 pieces. I have to read all of those. And they're all pretty much dealing with art theory and conceptualism, you know, books on Robert Smithson, books on Le Corbusier, and so that process of wanting to deconstruct the book also had the sense of educating me through sort of like a very autodidactic way that at the time I was actually only looking at as a process. It's sort of like you're not really looking at disseminating the information, but you are disseminating it in some way, right? You're forcing yourself to actually go and read these things, and somehow it just affects you. And so that became sort of like my learning of what conceptual art is, what post-conceptualism is, and I became more interested in other people's works, but at the same time actually producing my work. So now, after like about 15 years of self-education, I'm at the point, at this moment in time, of actually trusting that intuition, that sort of like autodidactic intuition, which is actually very difficult, because when I first started in art, it was all intuition and no critical information. And then I got into this sort of like concept-based phase where it's all criticism and not really an investigation into the materials. So now I'm trusting the knowledge that I've gained through intuition and dealing with more the materialism or the materiality of substances. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
So, you know, what you've just been talking about leads me to leap ahead to something that I wasn't intending to raise just yet, but this question of collecting, the idea of collecting art. You talked about actually entering art, which is fascinating, through collecting it and being interested in it, and moving over into, or simultaneously, producing work yourself, and the rest is history, as they say. And so I wonder if you can speak a little bit to what collecting art, or how collecting art intersects with producing art, and especially with this interesting problem that you raised about the notion of intuition versus critical inquiry, and how that compendium, I guess, fits together, or if you see it fitting together.
Well, let me start by saying that the interest in collecting art actually started not with contemporary art, but with Japanese ukiyo-e prints from the 19th century. I was actually quite interested in the printmaking process. And so there was a book fair that happened in Vancouver, and I happened upon that book fair, and I saw this really fantastic collection of Japanese woodblock prints from the 19th century. That kind of started me collecting that sort of genre of prints. And also, it complemented my interest in Japanese culture because I cultivate bonsai and I like haiku and kyoka verses. So there's that interest in there that sort of complemented. And from prints, I kind of like gravitated towards more contemporary Canadian prints. So I went and had a look at different types of printmaking media. Had a look at, let's say, the works by René Derouin or J.C. Haywood, Carl Haywood. And that kind of progressed into, okay, what about paintings? What about sculpture in contemporary art? But the interesting thing about it is the fact that all of this time that I'm actually educating myself from the visual perspective, I could never be satisfied with what the artists are telling me their influences are. When I sort of, let's say, have a look at, let's say, the work of a contemporary artist, I would go and have a look at it during an opening, and I would say, oh yeah, well, what were you thinking? It's kind of funny with openings, because I think most people would rather talk about their shoes rather than talk about their art on the wall. So, but sometimes I would actually get to a point where I would ask some really pointed questions to the artist. And I always feel that I'm not getting the full picture from the artist. So that kind of got me frustrated. And so the reasoning behind that is I went and said, well, if I can't get the answer from the artist, why don't I try becoming one? So that's kind of like what happened. It's like the first works that I did were actually works on paper, paintings, works on paper. and I kind of wanted to sort of get more information. So I started reading more. And that sort of like went into a sort of like a saturation of information. I wanted to saturate myself with a lot of information. I'm an artist who actually deals with a sense of density, a sense of duration, whether that's information density or whether that's sort of like material density. I'm interested in the durational aspects, whether that duration has to do with how long are you going to indulge in a project, or whether it doesn't really matter how much reading I do, I just have to get to a certain saturation point. So during that time I was able to actually formulate, I guess, more pointed questions to artists, to a point where I've become an artist and I can sort of answer a lot of the questions that I wanted to ask. But that was like the journey for me to go through that. And then I thought art collectors do this all the time. You know, if you're an art collector, you go and you're mesmerized by the beauty or by the visual imagery that you see, and what follows is the research, and then you keep on researching and researching, and then all these art collectors probably become artists like I do. It didn't dawn on me that not everybody does that. It's sort of it was just for me a logical progression in terms of like what I wanted to deal with. I wanted to get information, and the only way I can get information is to actually do it myself. And I'm that type of person. I'm a do-it-yourself type of person. And I deal with a level of saturation to a point where I can't take it anymore. And then I sort of relinquish that, and you trust the information that you've actually gathered. But going back to the collectors, I'm not sure whether it's a hard question to answer, because everybody has different levels of appreciation. And I'm learning that because like there's a lot of different types of art worlds out there. There's the institutional and the academic, there's the community engagement, there's like the political artists, there's so many, and you can't be interested in all of them. So you can be interested in a particular part of it. And I remember somebody sort of calling me a conceptual artist at one point, and I was going, really? Because I never really saw myself as that. You know, I always argue that yes, there is a concept, yes, there is an idea, but I don't see myself as classically conceptual. Maybe it's because I'm from Vancouver. A lot of people tend to sort of have that assumption. But I think the best way would try not to categorize yourself, because you tend to get trapped in that sort of mode, and you sometimes start believing it.
We've just been talking about this question of collecting and its relationship to production and the nexus we were just discussing. So you just mentioned the notion of the directed gaze, which is a phrase that we all know about, and I think somehow it's it links to something that you've spoken about, which, if I can quote, I'm really interested in ambient qualities. Ambient as being something that is there but is not perceived, something present but invisible. And you talk about reading or working between the lines, perhaps, particularly in your excision works. You want to explore that? Question of ambient.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the notion of ambient has sort of morphed more recently into more concept of being transient. Because I think it's the ambient quality is almost like this soft voice that's speaking to you, and you know it's present, it's always there, and you're not ignoring it, but there's a lot of things that are pressing at the moment that you're trying to explore, but you always have that voice in the background. And at the time that I was actually making the bookworks, there's always this sort of sense of the ambient qualities that my bookworks were actually trying to sort of silently. There are certain secrets. There's secrets to it. And at the time I wasn't really, I couldn't really discuss them because my ideas for them were not as fully formed as they are now. Now they're becoming much more pronounced. These issues deal more with, let's say, aspects of post-colonialism, deals with aspects of control mechanisms, because when you look at the bookworks, a lot of people tend to sort of look at the structural qualities of language and architecture, but they also sort of surreptitiously try to insert certain ideas on how language and architecture are used as post-colonial strategies for controlling, and at the time I didn't really want to sort of like pose those issues, because as a person, as an immigrant, it's too easy for people to sort of look at you and, I chose Paul de Guzman very carefully, because de Guzman, if you haven't really met me, you wouldn't really know. I remember having an anecdote with, having a conversation with a gallerist from Berlin, and we just spoke over the telephone, and I told him I'm going to be going to Berlin, visiting the gallery, and having a look, Paul de Guzman. And when we finally met, he looked at me and was going, de Guzman, de Guzman. He was pronouncing it in a very Germanic way. And the same thing happened when I met my Belgian dealer, because de Guzman has this Dutch quality to it. And so nobody really figured out that I'm actually Filipino-Canadian, So I would show up and then they would have this sort of like surprise. And that's kind of sort of the ambience that I talk about, and the ambience of actually having something simmering underneath, but you just don't know what it is until it confronts you. And the thing about the bookworks is that, it's been read as some sort of way of sort of bringing forth the relationship of architecture and language. Yes, of course, that's true. But it's also at the time anyways, a way of actually trying to deal with the incomprehensibility of what we've created in academic circles, right? How can I, an autodidactic person, sort of like dealing with contemporary art, how can I even manage to try and understand this language? But but you force yourself to do it, right? So that's another level of colonialism. Sort of like dealing with that aspect of, I want to be part of this, so this is what I have to sacrifice. And that's been sort of true to my entire life, because I fled Manila, the Philippines, because of political unrest there. There is this sort of like sense of impermanence as well. It wasn't really planned. It just kind of happened. My father just said, okay, we have to sort of ship you back to Canada. And so I felt this piece of luggage, it's very nomadic, very transient as well. But there's also this ambience about it, because at the time I wasn't really thinking that it was such a big deal. I was like 18, 19 years old, maybe the second time I left. So I didn't think it was that a big deal. But now, in retrospect, I thought, yeah, that was the right thing to do at the time. But I couldn't understand that. All I can understand was that I'm just being uprooted again.
I want to come back to something in connection with this, and I wanted to ask you, because I guess you're shifting from one thing to another, has certainly a lot of resonance with your background, but you talked earlier about the degree in which, as you read these books that you were employing for your production, that you absorbed an incredible amount of information. And I'm just wondering if, you talked about holding that in the background, but I'm wondering if in the question of moving forward with your work and changing your focus, whether the readings that you had done were central to that shift, or those shifts, as well as, of course, your background and life experience.
What do you mean there, exactly? The information. From what I understand, that the information that I've accumulated is also a part of the ambience about it too. It's almost like reading them and then filing it away for later on to disseminate. But were you talking more about the types of topics?
Yeah, the question of post-colonial discourse, for instance, which very well, of course, could be generated by your own life experience, but also, of course, is endemic in the readings that you have taken on over the years, just to name one region of discourse. And I wonder whether, as you've moved in your practice, whether those readings, and whether, let us say, for instance, post-colonial discourse, would have asserted itself as a result of the refined readings that you've taken on.
I think more from like a very general perspective. What it reinforced is actually the power of Western art history in terms of the dissemination of contemporary art. When you look at, let's say, the Biennale circuit, the Sao Paulo Biennale and all that, there's a lot of people who make work particularly for that. A lot of them are politically motivated. A lot of them have sort of like dealings with world views that are sort of like in the news right now. There's always this sense about, if you produce this type of work, you're going to be shown in this type of venue. And for example, if you're a Filipino artist making work about certain governmental policies back in Manila, you might be relegated to sort of like more museological or ethnographic sort of sensibility, right? And I was very sensitive to that. And I wanted to play with those ideas. I wanted to fuck people up, for one thing. It's almost like this, sort of like pulling the rug from under you type of thing. There's always that sense of it in my work. And it's only now that I'm actually able to actually go and discuss it, because I've gone through the work in a not very obvious way, but now I'm becoming a little bit more overt, but at the same time sort of looking at, let's say, all the readings that I've done as a way of neo-colonialism. Sort of like, yes, I'm reading what you're saying, but I'm going to interpret it in my way anyway. You know, it's almost that maybe it's more like a higher level of the assertion of the artist to have authority over their material, right? If you look at, let's say, the books that I have read, you know, I am asserting my sort of like right to be an artist, and I'm actually physically manipulating the information, even though it's manipulated in a very particular way to put you off the trail, right? So there's always that sensibility in the work that it's always been there, but I've never really wanted to discuss that because of the threat of having to be sort of like pigeonholed in something, right? But nowadays it's sort of like, it took me about 29 years before I returned to Manila. And 29 years is a long time. And when I returned, there were certain circumstances that happened that made me sort of like rethink that I can actually sort of exert this sort of I guess a sense of identity, you know, without having to risk too much, because I think it's something that's slipping away. I think as we get older, there are certain things that become more important. Very fundamental things that we have sort of sacrificed when we're trying to build a career, you know? And you get to a point where, you know, maybe that's not as important now, because there are certain things that are much more important that have taken precedent. And so that's kind of like where I'm at this moment. You know, there's still that sort of balance between sort of like being surreptitious about certain information. You know, I like to keep secrets, right? And that's part of the fun of it too, right? And then it kind of goes back to the frustration I had with artists and talking with them and me not getting enough information, and I thought, oh yeah, I get it now. You know, you want to keep some secrets, right? So that's another sort of like way of actually sort of perpetuating that you know, it became it wasn't very satisfying for me to sort of, because I'm not getting the information, but you know what, you have the right to actually keep your secrets, you know, and so that in the background that sort of finally made sense.
Paul, okay, so we're surrounded here in your lovely house with an amazing gallery of work. And I'm tempted to ask you about the work that's here around us, but I was very interested by a piece that I saw through your website that you did for the BNSC Biennale in Trois-Rivières, called Two Sides of a Flat Surface Are Not the Same. And I was intrigued by both the diagram and the images of the various pieces, as well as the installation. Do you want to talk a bit about that piece? 'Cause,
yeah, that started off, the Biennale in Trois-Rivières had a theme called Perdre pied, lost footing. And so I was working with that notion of losing one's footing, you know. And at the time, I was also visiting Manila after an absence of 29 years. And I was doing a lot of research there. And of course, walls are architectural elements that are quite significant in the world, and they have this sort of certain sense of duality about them. This sense of duality kind of informed that work because I found myself sort of going back to the place where I was born, but also living here in Canada. So I was trying to sort of traverse those two realities. But I didn't want it to be too informed by that. I wanted to sort of like extricate certain specific information when I was actually looking at that opportunity for Trois-Rivières. And one idea I wanted to explore was to actually create a wall, but which divides the space into two areas. But I wanted to have a certain sort of like minimal maximal type of quality to it. Like one side of the wall is pretty much just a white wall, but there are holes in it so that you can actually peek through, right? So when you're peeking through these holes, you don't really see the other side too well until you actually go through the wall and you see what the maximal effect is. It's almost like a certain duality of how people choose to live. There are always certain things that we tend to keep secret and certain things that we want to reveal to people. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to sort of express that as an expression of perdre pied, lost footing, because it's almost like trying to ask myself, do I have to decide whether I am going to be living in one side or the other, or can I actually be somewhere in the middle? Because a lot of us really deal with a certain duality in things, and in the sense of duality, it's really more of a universal construct of balancing things out. It's like the yin yang of certain things, if there's good and evil and all that stuff. And so a lot of that sensibility of actually trying to exist in two different sort of extremes informs a lot of the work that I've been doing lately. It all started out with it all started out when I was actually collecting postcards. You postally use postcards, because when you look at postcards, there is a certain duality with that really small archival thing. You have the urban picturesque that is being depicted as something idealized and utopian, and then when you reverse it and then you read people's experiences of it, it usually never really refers to the utopian ideal. Usually it goes and says, "Dear Martha, we're having a great time. By the way, how's that fig tree I gave you? Love you, hope to see you soon. Bart," or something like that. So there's that sort of sense of duality in that, in the mundane, in the banal, and then but you can also sort of like gravitate that towards like universal things. So that sense of duality started with that exploration of the postcard as an object, and then sort of like dealing with the experiences with people, sort of like a quotidian experience versus the utopian experience, And a lot of the things that you deal with in architecture are dealing with both quotidian and utopian ideas, right? And it just so happens that when you erect a wall, that wall is an architectural construct, right? It's just a structure, but for some reason it either protects or it separates people. It protects or separates realities. And that's kind of like the sense of duality that I find myself existing in right now, because my father, who is 91 years old, he lives in Manila. So I find myself going back to Manila just to sort of see how he's doing, right? And all of these experiences with family is pulling me back there. And I'm in a position now to actually sort of appreciate that, because it was something that I kind of abruptly left and I forgot. And then now I'm being pulled back into that reality. So I'm trying to sort of effect a sense of balance in the duality that I'm experiencing, from a very universal sort of sensibility down to the most quotidian and banal.
It's interesting, that duality can also be read, and in a way I think it's almost inevitable that the title flirts with this reading, a paradoxical reading. The notion that in fact duality, of course, the dualities that we experience, but also how they intersect, and in intersecting become paradoxical. Would you see paradoxes of interest to you in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really control how certain things evolve, you know. One of the things that I experienced when I was back in Manila was experiencing the walled city of Intramuros, which is actually a walled city around in the old part of Manila. And during the Spanish times, the elite Spanish people would actually live within the wall, and the undesirable indigenous and Chinese population would live outside the wall. Well, the Chinese people who lived outside that wall formed a district, and that is now the oldest Chinatown that exists in the entire world. It was established in 1582, 1584. And that district still thrives. And within the wall of Intramuros, that nobody lives there anymore because that's now just a tourist destination. So there's this sort of paradox of existence, wherein at a certain time there was this sort of like duality that existed because of that wall, and then we can't really predict what time it's gonna do. So there's always this sort of sense of change and longevity, and you never know what's going to happen 50 years down the road, right? So that sort of became catalytic in a lot of the things that I'm sort of exploring right now, you know, because I'm Filipino, but I'm also Chinese, because my father is Chinese, my mother is Filipino Spanish. So I see myself as the wall. I'm actually in the middle there, right? And that's kind of like the sense that I'm playing around with my name, Paul de Guzman. You know, you meet me and then you might think I'm German, you might think I'm Dutch, you might think whatever, but it's just the state of things. And it's just something that that I've learned to sort of embrace and mine for meaning, you know, in my life.
In a discussion some years ago, Paul, you developed a strong discourse around Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities.
Invisible Cities.
That was some years ago, and I wonder if you could speak to that and whether it still relates to the work that you're concentrating on today.
Yeah, I think with Invisible Cities, it's almost it's pretty much the representation of language, trying to give form, but to architecture. But it's also in a sense, you can look at it as almost like a folktale in terms of where it came from, you know, as derived from the voyages of Marco Polo into China, and so there's that sort of sense of the European going into the Asian unknown, and in a way, as I reflect on it now, it's almost like this sort of like a sense of duality as well, that seems to be merging, you know, because the world is such a global place right now that, you know, people like Marco Polo and Kublai Khan at the time, you know, when it wasn't really sort of being looked at as multicultural, right? It's really more of an exploration for Italo Calvino to explore those sensibilities in a symbolic and metaphorical way. Interested me a lot, and I think at the time too, I wasn't really thinking about dualities, you know. That sort of came after, and perhaps it's just one of those things where you absorb information and then it becomes ambient in your thinking, and then later on it sort of like asserts itself, you know. So there's that ambient, that quality that comes back to you. You know, you sort of like look at Italo Calvino in a literal sensibility. It's a literary construction. It's also a constructed literature. It sort of plays with architecture and language and architecture. And that also tends to sort of inform a lot of the work that I do up until now. You know, like even when you look at, let's say, my interest in postcards, there is that written, and there's that utopian architecture that sort of deals with that, right? And it's one of those ambient qualities that keeps on recurring. And I've learned to sort of, sometimes I fight to sort of like refine those ideas, but the more I fight, the more it sort of reasserts itself. And I think if I were to sort of try and define my work in terms of just a few words, I think certain it would have to be more a sense of duality in a lot of general things. Yeah.
Paul, I want to come to some questions here about the life of the artist, you might say. And I'm tempted to, of course, ask a very general, perhaps almost pretentious question. What is the relationship between being an artist and doing as an artist? But rather than dwelling on that, perhaps, I want to come to this point that you made earlier when we were talking about the amount of work that's required as a professional artist, quite outside the studio, working with the institutions of art. And you talked about being on boards and being on committees, and I had the impression that you enjoyed that intersection with other artists, perhaps, and with the institutions. Would you like to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I was on the board of the Western Front for about a few years ago, and I was also on the board of Center A for about a period of a year. And I recently stepped down, actually, after being on the board of Access Gallery, which is an emerging artist gallery in Vancouver's Chinatown. I'm also dealing with a lot of public art adjudications within the Lower Mainland, recommending artists for that. And that came about really more as a matter of wanting to expand my community, wanting to sort of experience more or different levels of art. For example, community-based art. You know, I'm also on the jurying committee for the East Side Culture Crawl. So all of these things just simply balance out. I find that for a period of about 10 years, I was engaged too much in one specific level, you know, which is the more the institutions and the museums, and even the commercial gallery. And I found it to be too didactic, too directed, and I wanted to sort of gain an appreciation for other levels of engagement with art, not just the institutions, not just the museums, but sort of people who are actually sort of creative individuals who are out there making a living, and they have an entirely different sort of clientele, for example, for lack of a better word, right? Like people who appreciate their work. And I'm trying to sort of get to that point of actually wanting, of appreciating what they have to offer, right? Because it's almost like what we were talking about earlier, wherein if you make political arts, you probably will qualify for like the Biennale circuit, you know, or if you make a certain sort of like type of work, it might be shown in art fairs, or certain types of work would be accepted in the Vancouver Art Gallery or the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Musée d'Art Contemporain. It's almost like there's this sort of established sort of marriage between certain levels of engagement with art. And looking back, I was kind of thinking, well, during that time, I was still in my 30s and early 40s, and it is what a lot of people, a lot of young artists go through, you know, because they go through the universities and that's all they know. And how are you going to sort of educate yourself in the other things that actually exist out there? the other valid creative outlets that are out there, you know. So recently I've been more interested in sort of diversifying that knowledge base for me. Call it a research project. Call it my museum for the administration of aesthetics, which is actually a nomadic entity that I created. It's almost like this museum on paper, because for me, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the works that I do are titled like proposals or study for, you know. And a lot can be gained when you actually just propose something rather than actually finishing the artwork, you know. That's the thing that I try and deal with in terms of the aspect of duration. When I talk about duration, not only do I want to work on projects for a very long time, I almost don't want them to end. And when I have a proposal, I know that it may fail, but it's still successful as a proposal, as an idea on paper. And the thing that I really enjoy about, let's say, public art adjudication is that all of these proposals that are tendered, and everybody has a discussion on it, and I see them as finished works of art as proposals, and the proposal as a finished work of art, right? They don't have to be built. Pretty much like the idea of, lots of things are actually proposed but never really built, right? And so what happens to all those proposals, some of those proposals are really quite fantastic. But it's our limitations as human beings, as creators, as builders, that actually limit the potential for those proposals, you know? You know, we just have to fault ourselves, right?
And that's certainly endemic in architecture, isn't it? That for every building that gets built, there must be hundreds, perhaps, of proposals that just become proposals.
Yeah, and a lot of it also are sometimes, well, a lot of it really has more to do with, let's say, the mindset of the developer, the mindset of the architect, how far are they willing to go, even to the point of actually creating a public art collection, you know. So the name of the artist comes into the picture as well, you know, like, and they want a certain sort of like a level of guarantee that the artist has this experience. It's a catch-22. It's a recent article in Canadian Art Magazine about how very few women are actually doing public art, and very few women are actually depicted in monuments, right? Because there's this sort of catch-22 where artists would have to build something before they're actually trusted by developers and architects, you know, because developers and architects, they go through a rigorous sort of like certification process, which is one of the reasons why I didn't actually bother when I came to Canada. You know, I'm going to have to go through 4 years of engineering school again. I'm not going to deal with that. And so all of that sort of like factors into like experience of the work that I do and my interest in sort of like unrealized proposals. I have proposed public art installations as well, and I have to admit that the joy in sort of like just presenting the work is enough for me. That might actually disqualify me from actually building public art, but I'm still gonna try, right? You know.
I guess if you don't try, then the proposal remains somewhat academic instead of being on the edge. But I'm wondering if you know the artist Gordon Lebret by any chance?
No, I'm not familiar.
Okay, because there's a lot that you have just spoken to that would resonate perhaps with Gordon's work. He's passed away now, but I want one other thing about that though. You talked about being a post-studio artist. Would that resonate with what you were just discussing?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at post-studio, it's really quite a complex issue, because I think when Nicolas Bourriaud first wrote about post-studio artists, he was actually really more interested in the nomadic and the transient life of the artist, going from residency to residency to residency, and that, of course, for a period of about 3 or 4 years, that's what I was doing. I was going from one residency to the other. But there's also this sense about the studio as the place where genius resides. Just to try and sort of like debunk that theory is almost like something to do with the post-studio phenomenon. You try to like say that no, it doesn't reside anywhere. Art can be made anywhere, right? And so having that nomadism or that sort of transient sort of like sensibility in your work bodes well for it. And at the same time, when you look at being nomadic and being transient, it also means that you're not dedicated to one medium. You can sort of like have an idea and determine for yourself whether will architecture work for that, will biochemistry work for that, will net art work for that, will painting work for that, and all that, right? So you're keeping yourself open as an artist based on what your ideas are.
I want to build on that, to ask the question, do you think that there's a dominant discourse or a mainstream discourse at work in visual art today, at Zeitgeist, I guess you could call it?
I think I'm the wrong person to ask that question. I think the last few years I've been actually concentrating on not being in that canon. I have this sort of inherent fear of trend because it leads to other things. Sometimes it leads you away from what you really want to do. It's a distraction. Mm-hmm. And I'm finding that more and more. And I mean, yesterday was the last time I read an article from Canadian Art Magazine for over like 2 years. And I'm still interested in what's happening. But at this moment in time, I'm more interested in trusting my intuition. And there's so much information out there that I don't even know what good art or bad art is anymore. And in a way, I really love that. I really love the fact that when I say I know what I like, that can be substantiated, as opposed to somebody going and saying, well, I know I like this, or I know I can do this, or whatever, right? But because I've been practicing for so long, I have to learn to sort of trust my instincts in the information that I've accumulated. That doesn't mean that that information is outdated. It's constantly being updated, but it's no longer looking at the zeitgeist, or because all of these trends and fashions will fade, right? And then maybe somebody will rediscover it. Maybe it's going to be the same with Van Gogh, and his sister-in-law being the main proponent for how we regard him today. And we forget that a lot of things tend to sort of like fizzle away and then get revived, right? We don't have any control over that. So why am I trying to sort of control that? I don't want to have to sort of control it by being a part of that zeitgeist or something, or part of a certain trend, right? And if it amuses me, then that's terrific. That's all. Then, but if it doesn't amuse me, then why am I going to go and sort of like think about it too much? There's just a lot of things to think about.
Perhaps you're exactly the right person to ask. It occurs to me as you were speaking about that, Paul, that you uncover a latent conflict between a notion of the authentic, which we don't want to necessarily confuse with originality, but the authentic, and the social, and the determination that you've just expressed, if I can put it this way, that authenticity lies in what interests you rather than in what is of interest, you might say, in the social or certainly the political realm of art discourse. But it raises another question, and I'd like to ask you this. As we talk, and as I hear you speak, I have a sense that you have if not a comedic understanding of the world, but certainly a readiness to see the comedic in circumstances. Would you agree with that?
I would even go further, saying the absurd, you know. And well, like what they say, like death is easy, comedy is hard, and comedy is not. I mean, like to sort of like imbue a certain sort of like sense of humor or the comedic in work, in artwork, it's very difficult,
Mm-hmm.
But I've always kind of like lived with that sort of sense of jocularity.
Mm-hmm.
I think people don't expect that of me because they sort of like look at the exactitude of my work, and just because the work is exact doesn't mean you don't have a sense of humor. They sort of like have this mistaken notion that just because you're a conceptual artist doesn't mean you don't know how to laugh.
You just raised this matter of how one is seen as an artist, and the different, and sometimes alarmingly different, viewpoints that seem to emerge. Of course, that leads me to criticism. And I'm just kind of curious, in your experience of criticism, of people writing about you, or writing about other artists, whether there's a particular way that you find criticism works most, especially well for you, or in your reading of the criticism of others, well for them. Do you have any thoughts on criticism and its strategies?
Well, criticism is really quite a difficult subject to sort of because there's sometimes always never enough, because there's never enough time, because you have so many words that you can only put in, and there's always this sense of challenge with critics. Most of it is really just reportage. And what is criticism? And I think people like, for example, MoMAs, the online publication, are trying to sort of address that by having a sort of like a higher level of criticism. And there also has to be a sense of distinction between the language that's used in criticism, which can be fairly academic. I think criticism addresses a certain audience, not just the artist. I think so. I've tried to sort of not read criticism about my work too much, because it kind of deals with the ego too much, and that doesn't really inform my work, But to sort of like maybe put a little bit of a wrench in the mechanism there, I mean, right now I'm really more interested in the subjectivities of what work can actually, like multiple readings or multiple subjectivities. And when you sort of look at that, criticism almost becomes very moot, because it's simply an opinion, right? Even though it's well researched and stuff like that, it's also, you have to sort of deal with how people react to a certain work of art. And that is a very complex thing, and all interpretations are valid, Just because I'm the artist doesn't mean that my interpretation is valid. It just means it's personal, it's autobiographical. it's not going to resonate with other people. It might not. If it does, then that's wonderful. There's that sense of commonality about it. But when you sort of like look at it in terms of like general ideas, then it's also useful. You know, when you look at criticism, you have to sort of like be very directed in terms of what you want to get out of it, right? And now, these days, I'm more interested in sort of like subjective interpretations rather than sort of like this global historic didactic sort of like reading of a work, right? Because when you look at who they're writing for, they're kind of writing for almost like an official history, as opposed to the collective quotidian experiences of people. And I'm more interested in the quotidian experiences of people, sort of like as a collective, right? Because that's how you create conversations with art. It's not just there is a pedagogical aspect to it, but at the same time, let's do this sort of like a two-way street here. Let's be dualistic in that sort of interpretation, right? I can tell you what I think of the work, and you may agree with it or not, but that's still like an opinion, right? Based on that person's individual realities and histories. So that's where I'm at right now.
I have to tell you that resonates nicely with a book launch that Philip Monk held in Toronto. And just very briefly, I won't go into it, was a fascinating evening, but the nub of the evening was that Philip, of course, had just written a book on 3 years in the late 1970s on Toronto's scene. His Toronto Burning was the title of the book. And there was a small panel that had been convened to discuss this in the evening. And out of that panel discussion, and I think it was Louis Jacob who most specifically stated it, the point was raised that perhaps, and I'm of course severely shortening the discussion on this, but the point that was raised was that, well, perhaps Philip's history was misguided, and that in fact any history of Toronto would have to be a history of gossip. Rather than some kind of attempt
official
to bring the whole thing together. And I think that resonated with a lot of people in the room. In fact, one person in the audience piped up and said, and that leads to rumor, doesn't it? So the nexus of rumor and gossip would seem to be, you know, one of those things we feel in our bones is somehow the way things are.
Yeah. And there's almost like the sense of the absurdity about it too. Like the comedic, right? We were talking about the absurdity and comedic, right? And I guess maybe that sort of segues into why I've gotten into this level of interpretation. You know, it's not just a certain democracy of interpretation. It's more a matter of just leveling the playing field, leveling the power structures that are out there, because you can't get away from that. I mean, you know, as human beings, we can't help but be administered, you know, and there are hierarchies and power structures out there who are always going to officiate whatever histories you may want to sort of, what they want to sort of like officiate, you know, and that usually doesn't take into consideration any other subjectivities, because it's also a source of power. So it's also like the hierarchies are power, our power stations, right? So where does that leave us, right? It's always, it sort of boils down to the point, you know, like, I know what I like. You almost want to believe that, right? Regardless of whether somebody has credentials to back it up or not, right?